Once upon a time, in the soft summer light of the year, 1530, the town of Maidstone stirred with an unease that could not be named, though it hung in the morning mist like the echo of something cruel. Something coming. People whispered of a man, a quiet, book-carrying man who had dared to speak truths not approved by the priests, who had read aloud the words of Christ, not in the Latin of kings and bishops, but in the muddy, earthy English of field hands and candle makers and little boys who worked in the alehouses. His name was Thomas Hitton, and though no monument had yet been raised to him, though he had no army, nor title, and no golden chain around his neck, the words he carried in his heart were so dangerous that the crown itself had decided they must be burned away, syllable by syllable, until nothing remained but ash and smoke. In those days, words could get you killed. Not just any words, but holy ones, words that, if uttered by the wrong man in the wrong place, could turn parchment into poison and prayers into rebellion. The Bible, that most sacred of books, was not to be held by common hands, nor spoken in the tongue of farmers and mothers and sailors. Latin was the language of God, they said, and God did not speak to everyone, only to the priests who had been trained to hear him. But Thomas, once a Catholic priest himself, had begun to question that. He had read books that came from across the sea, smuggled into England inside, sacks of grain and bolts of cloth, and he had read them not with fear but with fire, and that fire was not easily extinguished. He had once worn the robes of the church, bowed his head under cathedral ceilings, spoken his blessings in Latin with solemn grace. But something had shifted in him slowly at first, like the cracking of ice under pressure. And then all at once, as if a dam had broken, he had come to believe, not with recklessness, but with deep and trembling certainty, that every soul had the right to read the words of God for themselves, that a ploughboy in Norfolk deserved the same scripture as a cardinal in Rome, that a widow who lit candles in secret should hear the voice of Christ, not through a veil of ritual, but in the clear, plain speech of her own heart. This belief, simple and tender as it seemed, was enough to bring down the full weight of the kingdom upon him. It did not begin with fire. It began with footsteps careful, quiet ones in back alleys and behind cathedral walls, as Thomas found others who believed what he did. They gathered in hidden rooms, beneath creaking rafters and behind false panels, sharing copies of the English Bible, translated by William Tyndale, a man who himself was already marked for death. These meetings were not grand or loud. They were soft, to reverent, lit by single candles and fueled by the kind of courage that doesn't shout, but holds its breath and steps forward anyway. Thomas became not just a reader but a teacher, guiding others through the sacred lines, explaining how the words could belong to them. 2. He read the Gospels to them in English, and they wept, not because they were afraid, but because they understood, some of them for the first time in their lives. But the church was listening, always listening, and it had ears in many places. It was not long before someone, perhaps afraid, perhaps jealous, perhaps simply desperate, betrayed Thomas. His name was never recorded, which is often the way with cowards. But the betrayal was swift and effective. A raid came in the night, not with fanfare, but with the quiet efficiency of those who knew exactly what they were looking for. They found the books. Of course, the forbidden texts, marked and thumbed and cherished. They found letters, notes, names, but most of all, they found Thomas, calm but unrepentant, with no sword to protect him and no lie to shield him. They took him to trial, but it was not a trial in the way you might imagine. There was no jury of peers, no chance to plead innocence, for there was no question of guilt. He had held the books, he had read them aloud, he had taught others to do the same. These were facts, and facts in Tudor England could be more dangerous than rumours. The court, presided over by powerful bishops and churchmen who saw in Thomas not a man but a threat to the entire order of the world, heard his voice only long enough to confirm that he still believed what he believed. And then, the sentence. Burning. The word fell like a stone into the silence of the courtroom. Not hanging, not imprisonment, but fire. A death designed not just to end a life, but to make an example. A punishment chosen not for justice, but for spectacle. They would not only kill Thomas, they would show everyone how a man is turned to smoke for daring to believe that God might love him directly. The weeks between his sentencing and execution passed slowly. He was kept in a cell where the air was damp and the walls bled with cold. Some came to visit him, not out of kindness, but to persuade him to recant, to confess his error, to say that yes, perhaps he had misunderstood, that perhaps the Latin was enough, that perhaps God was too holy to be read in English. But he refused, not because he wanted to die, but because the truth, once seen, cannot be unseen, and to pretend otherwise would be to kill something deeper than his body. Outside, the word of his execution spread. It was to be held on a market day, on purpose, so the town would be full, so the crowd would be thick, so the fire would burn not only a man, but a message into the minds of every butcher, every cloth seller, every boy sent to town with his mother's coin. The stake was built in the town square, tall and cruel, surrounded by bundles of dry wood stacked with surgical precision. The Bibles Thomas had once held were brought, too, not to be preserved, but to serve as kindling, words becoming ash. On the morning of the execution, the air was strangely still. There was no breeze, not birdsong, only the hush of 1,000 feet gathering, and the clink of armor from the guards, and the creak of the cart that carried Thomas to the place where he would die. He wore no crown, no robe, nothing to mark him as the hero he would become, only plain clothes, and a calmness that startled even those who had come to jeer. In his hands, they placed the books that had condemned him. He did not flinch. The fire came slowly, as fire often does when it is cruel. It began with smoke, then sparks, then the sound, the awful sound that people would remember long after they had forgotten why the man was burned in the first place. His voice rose with the flames, not in curses, but in psalms. And for a moment, the square was silent, except for the crackle of wood and the strange, a holy music of a man dying for a belief, too gentle for the world around him. And then he was gone, but not quite, because in that silence, something changed. People who had never held a Bible began to wonder why they could not. Children asked their fathers what the man had done. Women lit candles in secret and whispered prayers in English. And the fire that had been meant to destroy Thomas instead set alight something much harder to extinguish: the quiet, stubborn idea that the truth is not the property of the powerful, but the inheritance of all. And so, even as his body turned to ash, Thomas Hitton became something more than a man. He became a memory, a question, a spark. And that is where our story must pause for now. But when you return to your dreams tonight, remember that this is only the beginning. For tomorrow, in the next part of our story, we will step backwards into the life that led him to the stake, the corridors of power and whispers of rebellion, the hands that gave him books, and the voices that tried to silence him, and the secret, sacred fire he carried long before it ever reached the wood, long before the fire, long before the crowd gathered in Maidstone to watch the smoke rise and the stake blaze. There was another Thomas, a younger man wrapped in silence and obedience, walking slowly through the stone cloisters of a church that still felt holy to him, whose every creak of floorboard and every scent of candle wax echoed with a kind of reverence that both comforted and confined. For in those early years, Thomas Hitton did not dream of rebellion, or martyrdom, or flame. He dreamed only of serving God as he had been taught to, in Latin syllables and shadowed chapels, under the heavy hands of older priests who measured holiness in ritual and obedience, not in questions or conviction, and so he studied as they instructed. He prayed when and where they permitted, and he wore his robes with care, never once imagining that the very same hands which once turned pages of sacred texts in service to the church would one day smuggle those same texts across borders in secret. Wrapped in wool and hope and treason, he had been born in Norfolk, into a world where religion was not a choice, but a structure built into the very bones of life, where the church dictated not only how one worshipped, but how one was born, how one married, how one worked, and most certainly how one died. And from a young age, Thomas showed the kind of quiet seriousness that made older men nod with approval, the kind of contemplative silence that seemed made for the priesthood. And so it was not surprising that he was sent to be trained. His days soon filled with lessons in Latin grammar, theology, church law, and the art of listening without interrupting, of speaking, only when it was his turn, to recite the sacred formulas passed down like relics from the centuries before. And for a time, this life suited him, for it gave him certainty, routine, the security of knowing that the world was ordered, and that he had a place within it, tucked beneath the robes of tradition, serving a faith that demanded little more than obedience and careful speech. But even in those early years, there were moments, small ones at first, that stirred something beneath the surface of his soul. The look on a poor man's face when he was turned away from the altar for not understanding the priest's Latin, the sound of a child whispering questions that no one would answer, the weariness in a widow's voice as she asked why God's mercy had to be translated by men who never looked her in the eye, and these moments lodged themselves in Thomas like tiny splinters of doubt. Not enough to wound him yet, but sharp enough to stay. The first real shift came not through argument or crisis, but through books. Books that should never have reached his hands. Books that crossed the channel in the bellies of ships, hidden among grain sacks and bolts of cloth. Books that bore the names of men already condemned by Rome. Men like Martin Luther and William Tyndale. Men who had dared to write the words of Scripture not in Latin, but in the languages of the people. And when Thomas first held one of these books, the air in the room seemed to change. He opened the pages as though opening a window after a long winter. And what he found there was not heresy, not poison, but light. So much light he could barely stand it. For these words were not bound by incense and stone, but spoke plainly, directly, as if God had stepped down from the pulpit and into the dirt beside him. At first he read in secret, heart pounding, ears tuned to every creak of the monastery door. But the more he read, the harder it became to stop, and soon he was not just reading but wrestling with what it meant to serve a church that forbade the very words that had awakened his soul, wrestling with the knowledge that the priesthood he had entered as a sacred calling was, in truth, a structure built to keep the people from the very God they worshipped. And with each passing week, the gap between what he believed and what he was allowed to preach widened into a canyon. And something had to give. It did not happen all at once. There were no slammed doors, nor dramatic exits. Thomas was not the kind of man to storm out of a church in protest. Instead, he drifted away from the old world as gently as he had entered it. One silent refusal at a time. One whispered, reading group at a time. Until at last he was no longer wearing the robes of the Catholic Church, but walking in ordinary clothes among ordinary people, reading them the gospel in their own tongue, and watching their eyes fill with tears, not of fear, but of recognition. By the early 1530s, he had joined the network of reformers led from afar by William Tyndale, who had fled to the Low Countries to escape execution, but whose English Bibles were being smuggled back into England with a bravery and precision that rivaled any spy ring. And Thomas, with his education and priestly authority, became one of the most effective agents of this movement, not only distributing the texts, but explaining them, interpreting them, teaching from them in secret gatherings across Kent and beyond, kindling in kitchens and barns and alleyways the fire that would soon consume him. It was dangerous work, and he knew it. Every Bible handed out was an act of defiance. Every lesson taught was an arrow aimed at the heart of the Catholic monopoly. He had no illusions about what would happen if he were caught. But the alternative silence, submission, complicity was no longer bearable, and so he travelled quietly, carrying the word as though it were a candle in a land soaked in oil, trusting in God and in the courage of those who hid him, fed him, listened to him. The English Reformation, though still unformed and fragile, was being born not in royal courts or cathedrals, but in these quiet acts of rebellion. And Thomas was its midwife. He knew the danger was growing. The Crown's agents were everywhere. And the Church, backed by Henry VIII's increasingly volatile authority, had begun to move more aggressively against men like him. Spies slipped into prayer circles. Trusted allies turned suspicious. And one day, as it always does in such stories, the net closed. A betrayal, though he never knew from whom. A knock in the night. A search that turned up not just books, but letters, names, evidence. They dragged him away. Not as a priest, not even as a man, but as a threat. And the cell they threw him into was cold and dark. But he was not afraid. Not anymore. For he had known for some time that this path led to flame. The interrogations were cruel but predictable. They asked him to name others. He did not. They asked him to renounce the books. He would not. They asked him whether he still believed what he had taught. He did, again and again. They offered him mercy in exchange for silence, safety in exchange for surrender. But Thomas, calm and resolute, knew that to save his life at the price of his truth would be a worse death than any fire. And so, the trial was brief, the sentence swift, and the days that followed were filled with preparations not for his salvation, but for his spectacle. The authorities planned the execution not as justice, but as warning. But Thomas, even as he faced the flames, did not look like a man broken. He looked like a man who had chosen the price of his conviction and would pay it without fear. But that moment has already passed for now. Let us return to the beginning, not of his end, but of his undoing, for in part 3, we will step inside the secret rooms where the Bibles were sewn into coats, where Thomas whispered to dock workers and barmaids and farmers, where each book smuggled into England was a spark of defiance, and where the underground church began to breathe with the rhythm of rebellion. The fire had not yet touched him. But in truth, Thomas Hitton had already stepped into the heat, long before the stake was ever raised in Maidstone. For the most dangerous part of his journey was not the trial or the execution, but the long, quiet days spent carrying forbidden words through a kingdom that feared the Bible more than it feared the sword. And it was in those twilight spaces between safety and exposure, between silence and song, that Thomas became something more than a priest or a heretic. He became a smuggler of light, moving not through tunnels or battlefields, but through barns and taverns, through the back rooms of merchant houses and the rocking bellies of creaking ships, where scripture, hidden beneath sacks of wool, travelled farther than any royal decree and burned brighter than any torch. The smuggling network was not born from warlords or kings, but from ordinary hands, calloused hands, trembling hands, hands that packed crates and stitched pages into coats, hands that shook as they passed the word from person to person. Each link in the chain, knowing that a single misstep meant torture, death, and the slow unravelling of a fragile dream. And yet they persisted, not because they had faith in safety, But because they had faith in something greater, something eternal and urgent, that no iron bar or papal bull could extinguish, the books came mostly from Antwerp, where William Tyndale worked in exile, pouring his brilliance into pages inked in English, believing with every breath that God's truth did not belong to Rome or Canterbury, but to every mother who prayed over her child, and every farmhand who turned his face to the sky and asked questions too large for Latin. And so the Bibles were printed small, their fonts delicate, their bindings plain, their pages thin as leaves, perfect for hiding, for wrapping in cloth, for sliding between barrels of ale and salted fish, and they arrived on English shores like whispers, carried by merchants who nodded solemnly when the cargo was unloaded, who made no record of the boxes that passed from hand to hand in the silence before dawn. Thomas did not stand at the ports or lift the crates himself. His role was more delicate, more dangerous, for he was the one who explained what the books meant, the one who answered when the people, fumbling through strange names and ancient commandments, asked what it all meant for them, for their children, for their sins, for their hope. And so he travelled from village to village, from city edge to countryside, not with a pulpit or procession, but with a satchel and a voice and a steady gaze, teaching under thatched roofs and behind shuttered windows, gathering small groups who listened as though the roof might split open with thunder at any moment. And perhaps it often did, for to hear the word in your own language, in a voice like your neighbour's, it was no small thing. It was revolution. There is something deeply quiet, almost reverent, about rebellion that is built on books rather than swords, on ink rather than blood. For Thomas did not seek to overthrow the king, nor did he raise banners or claim a new theology as his own. He simply read what had always been read, but aloud, and in English, and with such calm conviction that the people began to believe not in him, but in themselves, in their right to understand, to question, to kneel, without being told how to kneel. And it was this empowerment, more than any creed or verse, that frightened those in power. For a people who can read God's word are a people who may one day read the laws that bind them and ask why. There were near misses. Of course, at least once, he had to flee a town by night, a trail of embers in his wake, where a fire meant for warmth had almost become a fire meant for destruction. Another time, he burned a bundle of Tyndale's New Testaments himself, not out of fear, but out of mercy. Better to watch them vanish in a field than see them used as evidence against the kind woman who had hidden him in her cellar. He grew thin from travel, from hunger, from caution, but not from regret. Every knock on the door was a risk. Every name spoken aloud was a gamble, and yet he kept moving forward, because the gospel had become not just a book, but a burden he was willing to carry to the very end. He spoke softly when he taught, not out of fear, but to draw the people in, to make them lean close, to feel the weight of the words not as thunder, but as breath. And they listened. These bakers and blacksmiths and seamstresses, these children who had never heard a psalm in English, and these elders who had grown old thinking God's voice was too high for their ears. And when Thomas read to them the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the meek, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness," the silence was so deep it felt like prayer itself had curled into the corners of the room to listen. 2. Not all welcomed him. There were whispers in the taverns, sideways glances at markets. A few priests cursed his name from the pulpits, accusing him of poison, of corruption, of dragging souls into hell. But Thomas never replied with fury. He had no use for shouting matches or theological sparring. He simply kept walking, kept teaching, kept giving away the books that weighed nothing in the hand, but everything in the soul. Yet he knew the walls were closing in. He saw the tightening of laws, the sharper tone in the sermons, the increase in arrests. The crown was no longer just watching it, was hunting Henry VIII. Still caught in the chaos of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, had not yet broken with Rome, and his devotion to Catholic orthodoxy burned as hot as any pyre. Heresy was not merely disobedience, it was treason, and the fires that once consumed witches and traitors were now being lit for those who dared to read. It was in the town of Gravesend. Historians think, or perhaps in one of the villages nearby, where someone betrayed him, not with malice, perhaps, but with fear, or desperation, or simply the promise of a coin, and from that moment forward, the gospel he had once smuggled became the rope around his wrists. The book in his hand, now transformed by royal decree into a weapon of insurrection, and the words that had set so many free would now become the words that sealed his fate. But that night, perhaps his last free night, Thomas did not run. He could have. He knew the hiding places, the routes to Antwerp, the faces of those who would risk everything to help him vanish. But instead, he stayed. He taught. He read aloud from the book that was already marked for fire. And in that moment, surrounded by the very people he might have saved, he chose again, as he had always chosen, not silence, but truth, not safety, but love, not escape, but endurance. And so when they came for him, he did not resist. He looked them in the eye. He handed them the book, and as they dragged him away, it is said he whispered the Lord's Prayer, not in Latin, but in English. And that, perhaps, is the true beginning of his end. But his story does not end here. Not yet. In part 4, we will walk beside him through the interrogation chambers, through the false mercy and cold cells, through the trial where the verdict was decided long before the gavel fell, and through the final days when even the cruelest authority could not break the peace of a man who knew his death would speak louder than his life ever had. There are trials that seek truth, and there are trials that serve only to display power, and Thomas Hitton, as he sat in the cold stone chamber where bishops in crimson robes prepared his sentence, knew without doubt that he had not been summoned for justice but for ritual, that the questions he would be asked were not meant to illuminate but to condemn, that the scrolls and scribes and solemn oaths surrounding him were not instruments of fairness but weapons cloaked in sacred form. And yet he entered the hall without fear, not because he believed he would be spared, but because he had already made peace with the price of his belief, and because a man who has nothing to hide is a man who cannot be humiliated, only silenced. The air in the courtroom was heavy with incense, and the unspoken tension of watching men pretend they were not afraid of the fire they commanded. And as Thomas was brought forward in chains, the silence that followed was not reverence but calculation. The kind of stillness that cloaks a room when the outcome is certain, and everyone present simply waits for the pageantry to conclude. And so they asked him to kneel, not out of respect, but to remind him of his place. And he did, not as a gesture of defeat, but because kneeling was familiar to him, he had knelt in prayer. In grief, in confession, and even now, he knelt not before his judges, but before the truth that lived inside him. Untouchable by flame or law, the questions began as expected, sharp and rehearsed, designed not to probe, but to entrap. And they asked if he denied the authority of the Pope, and he said he did, not with defiance, but with sorrow. For a shepherd who hoards the word is not a shepherd at all, but a gatekeeper guarding a kingdom built on exclusion. They asked if he believed the bread and wine became the literal body of Christ, and he answered that the Spirit of God did not require magic to be present, that it lived within the believer and could not be conjured like a spell. They asked if he thought salvation came through faith alone, and he said yes, not because it was fashionable, but because he had seen too many poor men buried in unblessed ground simply because they could not afford the rights of the church. And they asked again and again why he insisted on reading the Bible in English, and each time he answered softly, clearly, as though speaking to children, because God is not a foreign tongue, but their ears were closed long before their mouths had opened. For this was not a conversation but a condemnation, and each answer he gave was marked not as insight but as evidence. And the scribes wrote his words with ink that would soon be matched by fire. And the bishops, pretending to deliberate, exchanged glances that had already decided his fate before his chains had cooled. And all the while, Thomas stood with the calm of a man who had nothing left to prove. The trial was held, not in secret but in public, for its purpose was not only to punish him, but to perform a lesson for others, to show that even a priest, especially a priest, could be broken if he stepped beyond the boundaries drawn by Rome and reinforced by Henry. And so the people were invited to watch. Though few understood the charges, and fewer still understood the man, but they came anyway, drawn by curiosity, by fear, by the strange gravity of watching a man be judged not for what he had done, but for what he had believed. And they watched as he was accused not of theft, nor of treason, but of having spoken the words of Christ too plainly, of having made sacred knowledge too accessible, of having opened a door that centuries of power had worked to keep shut. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself presided William Warham, old and grim, whose hands had blessed kings and signed burn orders. And he looked at Thomas not with pity but with the weariness of a man who had seen too many like him, too many who believed conscience could stand above church, too many who mistook sincerity for innocence, and he pronounced the sentence with the tone of inevitability, as though he were merely confirming the rising of the sun or the fall of a leaf that Thomas Hitton, former priest and present heretic, should be handed over to secular authorities to be burned until his body be consumed to ash, and that such punishment was necessary to preserve the peace and purity of Holy Church. They called it relaxing to the secular arm, as though it was something gentle, as though what came next was no longer the concern of the bishops who had condemned him, but of the executioners who would carry out their will. And this fiction that the Church did not shed blood was preserved with great ceremony, though everyone in the room knew that the fire belonged to the martyr as much as to the crown. And so Thomas was led away, not with struggle, but with a strange stillness that unsettled even those who believed themselves righteous. And as he passed through the corridors of the court, past the rows of pillars and the painted saints who stared down with eyes that had never blinked, he did not weep, did not rage, did not beg, for his trial, though conducted in Latin and sealed with royal seal, had ended long before he entered the hall. The real trial had taken place in his heart, in the quiet moments of choice, when he first held the English gospel in his hands and decided he could no longer pretend not to understand. The days that followed were a strange kind of limbo, for though he had been condemned, the execution could not proceed without preparation, and so he waited in a small, damp cell where the light came in only at an angle, and the food was handed through a slit in the door, and the silence was deep enough to press against his ribs, and he could hear the sounds of the city preparing for market day. Unaware that the square where apples and wool were usually sold would soon become the place where a man would be turned into warning, they offered him chances. Even then, officials came, cloaked in the authority of mercy, asking him to recant, to retract, to surrender, to sign a statement written in script, ornate enough to disguise the treachery it contained. And each time, he declined, not with arrogance, but with clarity, saying not that he welcomed death, but that he could not call false what he knew to be true, and that to renounce the gospel now would be to spit on every ear that had heard it from his lips. Outside the prison walls, rumors spread. Some said he was mad. Some said he had confessed. Others said he had named names and begged for forgiveness. But none of it was true. He wrote no retraction. He spoke no betrayal. He asked only for a final prayer. And when they granted him a Bible, for they could not bring themselves to deny a man, his last scripture, they gave him a Latin one, thinking it would humiliate him. but he opened it with a calm smile, for he could still read it, even in the language of his persecutors. And he whispered the words of Paul beneath his breath, "I am not ashamed of the gospel." And so the morning came. Market day. A perfect crowd. But that belongs to the next part of the story. For now, let us leave Thomas in his cell, candle guttering low, a sliver of pale light crawling across the stone wall as he traces with his finger the words he has read 1,000 times before. The words he knows he will carry into the fire, not on parchment, but in memory. And in part 5, we will walk with him to the stake, through the jeers and the solemnity, through the spectacle designed to terrify, through the fire that could only burn flesh. Not faith, it began, as executions always do, not with fire, but with footsteps slow, heavy, measured, echoing across the cobblestones of Maidstone's central square, where the market stalls had been cleared away to make room for something far less ordinary than wool or apples, something far more permanent than a price or a promise. And as the procession moved forward, led by guards in tarnished armour and clergy in red and white robes, the crowd that had gathered did not speak. Not at first, for though they had come with the usual mixture of curiosity, dread, and morbid fascination, there was something in the air that morning, something too still, too sharp, that made even the most hardened among them hesitate to cheer. Thomas Hitton, walking barefoot with wrists bound, did not look like a threat to church or crown. He looked like a teacher, like a man who had carried too many books and slept in too many barns and lost too much weight to the long road of conviction. And yet it was precisely because he looked so ordinary, so familiar, so human, that his presence in chains unsettled the town, for they had been told heretics were monsters, whispering poison and defying God. But this man, this thin, sun-browned, quiet man, walked like someone who had already forgiven them for watching him die. He held nothing in his hands, for they had taken the book from him at the prison gates. But his lips moved silently with verses. No flames could scorch. And as he approached the stake that had been built in the middle of the square, a rough post surrounded by dry bundles of faggots, carefully arranged to prolong agony rather than hasten death, he did not falter, did not glance away, did not weep, but only lifted his eyes to the sky, as though searching for a familiar face in the clouds. Perhaps the face of the God who had once whispered to him through Latin prayers and now stood waiting at the edge of this world with open arms. The crowd thickened as the final preparations began. Townsfolk had been summoned from every corner of Kent, not by invitation, but by instruction. For the church and the crown understood that a public death meant nothing if it was not seen. And so children sat on their fathers' shoulders, and women clutched their shawls more tightly. And the vendors, though their stalls had been removed, whispered beneath their breath about the price of meat and the price of silence. And the air buzzed, not with life, but with a kind of suspended breath, as though everyone present understood that what was about to happen would linger not only in the streets but in the marrow of memory. They brought out the kindling first old books, discarded crates, wood from the local parish yard, and among them, carefully placed atop the pile, like a crown upon a funeral pyre, were copies of the English New Testament, Tyndale's translations that Thomas had once read aloud to children and farmers in candle-lit corners, and the symbolism was not lost on anyone watching, for it was not only a man they were about to burn, but the word he carried, the language he had dared to use, the right he had claimed for all to read, what had long been locked away behind Latin and liturgy. The sermon came next. Of course, there was always a sermon. A priest stood before the crowd and began to speak, not of mercy or grace, but of rebellion, of order, of obedience. And he painted Thomas not as a martyr, but as a danger, a seed of rot that had to be cut away lest the whole tree of England wither, and as the words echoed across the square, Thomas stood beside the stake, his arms now tied behind him, his back straight, his gaze fixed not on the preacher, but beyond the guards, beyond the roofs, beyond the smoke already rising from hearths that would cook bread that day, while his body turned to ash. Then came the silence, that long, unnatural quiet that arrives just before something irreversible, and in that pause, even the birds seemed to hush their wings. And Thomas, when asked for his final words, did not curse, did not scream, did not beg, but spoke a single sentence, clear and soft, heard only by those standing nearest. "You may burn the book, but not the truth." And with that, the torch was lowered. The first lick of flame touched the dry wood with a crackle that sounded like a whisper, and then another, and another, and within moments, the fire began its ascent, not with the fury of a bonfire, but with the cruel slowness of an execution designed for spectacle, and it crawled up the bundles of kindling, pausing just beneath his feet, as if testing him, waiting for fear to arrive, but it never did. For Thomas remained still, eyes closed now, lips still moving, not in prayer for rescue, but in prayer for those watching, those weeping, those too frightened to speak. The fire touched his robes and began to climb, and the sound it made, the awful, tearing, hissing sound, was joined by gasps from the crowd. And still Thomas did not scream. Not at first. Not until the flames reached his skin, and the pain became not a warning, but a reality. And then the cry came, ragged, real, rough, and it cut through the square like a sword. And there were those who turned away, and those who did not. Those who wept, and those who watched with clenched fists. And still the fire rose. It is said that he sang that somewhere in the middle of the pain, in the middle of the burning, Thomas began to sing a psalm, not in Latin, but in English, and though the words were broken by breath and smoke and agony, the tune was recognizable, and those who knew it mouthed it along with him, silently, as tears slipped down their cheeks, for they understood now that what they were seeing was not only a death, but a declaration that this man, in his final moments, had become a living gospel, written not on parchment, but on the skin and bone of a single, fragile body. And when at last his voice stopped, when the flames took what remained of his breath, and the ropes fell away and the body slumped forward, the crowd did not cheer, did not clap, did not return to their errands at once, but stood, quiet, stunned, as though something ancient had cracked open in the earth beneath them. And the silence that followed was not peace, but the hush of history taking root. When the ashes cooled, they were swept away without ceremony, scattered like dust across the cobblestones. But something of Thomas remained, not his body, not his books, but the echo of his conviction, the sound of scripture spoken in a mother's tongue. And though the authorities believed they had extinguished a fire, they had instead set one loose, a fire that would burn in whispers and printing presses, in pulpits and prayers, until the very church that had condemned him would one day read from the very book he died to share. And so, while the gospel may have burned that day in Maidstone, it did not burn alone, nor did it burn in vain. But the story does not end in ash. Not yet. In part 6, we will follow the embers into the letters written in secret, into the hearts of those who could not forget what they had seen, into the rebellion Thomas never lived to see but helped to ignite. The fire had died. The square had been swept clean. And the world, or at least the part of it ruled by bishops and kings, moved on as if nothing had happened, as if a man had not been burned to death before their eyes, as if the smoke had not carried his final breath upward like a psalm torn from the throat of history. But not everyone forgot. Not everyone went home untouched. For some had seen more than just flame. They had seen conviction. They had seen a body break, and a soul remain unbent. And though no monument was raised for Thomas Hitton, and no songs were sung in the open streets, the memory of what he had done, what he had dared to believe, lingered in the corners of England like an ember buried beneath ash, waiting for the wind. And the wind came, not with fanfare or armies, but in letters passed from hand to trembling hand, in books still hidden in crates and stitched into hems, in whispered teachings beneath candlelight, where the gospel was still spoken in English, even as the price for doing so had been written in blood. And those who had once listened to Thomas farmers, bakers, weavers, children remembered not only his words, but his face. The way he had smiled when he read the Beatitudes. The way he had knelt, not to plead, but to proclaim. And in the months that followed, they did not speak his name loudly, but they did speak it. In kitchens, in markets, in chapels that creaked under the weight of old prayers and new courage, across the Channel, in Antwerp, where William Tyndale still lived in cautious exile. The news arrived by coded message, wrapped in Latin, laced with sorrow. Hitton, captured and executed, burned for the gospel. And Tyndale, who had watched many fall already, who had learned not to flinch when news like this reached his door, sat still for a long time before he replied, his pen moving slowly, each word a monument carved in ink. Then the truth is more dangerous than we imagined, and more precious. He wrote of Thomas in his letters not as a warning, but as a witness, and those letters travelled like pilgrims, slipping past customs and swords, until they reached England's underground church, where they were copied by hand, smudged by tears, and hidden in floorboards and under loaves of bread. And soon, Thomas was no longer just a name, but a sign, a symbol, a story retold in low voices. His death, not the end of a movement, but its beginning, for even as the Crown intensified its search for heretics, even as bishops ordered more fires to be built, the people began to change, not all at once, not loudly, but deeply, in ways that the Church could not see until it was too late. And the very language that had once damned Thomas began to spread like wildfire, not through rebellion, but through longing, the longing to know, to read, to hear the voice of God in a tongue that felt like home. Children were taught to memorize verses, not in Latin, but in English, hidden in nursery rhymes and songs hummed while sweeping. And old women who could not read still gathered in secret to hear younger ones read aloud the words Thomas had once carried in his satchel. And men who had stood in the crowd that day in Maidstone found themselves haunted, not by the flames, but by the silence that had followed, by the way they had looked away. And they began, in small ways, to look again. In London, the authorities raided homes and confiscated books. Yet each time they burned one, 3 more seemed to appear. And the more they punished, the more they proved the truth of what Thomas had died for, that the gospel, once awakened, could not be caged again. It was not just the peasants who remembered. A few within the church, silent and troubled, began to question not openly, not dangerously, not yet, but they began to wonder whether Thomas had truly been a heretic, or whether the heresy was in the fear that had killed him. And though they still wore their robes and spoke their mass in Latin, something in them had shifted, a quiet doubt growing like ivy beneath stone. Time moved, as time always does, and other names came, other martyrs, other flames. But those who lit the fires remembered the first man burned under Henry's hand, the one who had once been their own, and they whispered among themselves that perhaps they had started something they could not stop. Thomas had not left behind children, or wealth, or writings of his own, but his legacy was etched into the souls of those who had heard him, seen him, loved him. And as the Reformation began to move like a storm across Europe, his story became part of the thunder. Not the loudest, not the most famous, but always there beneath the noise, beneath the laws, beneath the very ground of England's changing soul. Years later, when Henry would break from Rome, when English Bibles would be placed upon lecterns in cathedrals where only Latin had once lived, there would be those who paused, just for a breath, and thought of Thomas, thought of the man who had walked barefoot to his death, so that others might one day read without fear. And though the king would never speak his name, and the church would never offer apology, the pages that turned in those new Bibles would carry the weight of his voice in every line, and so the embers lived on, not in monuments or stained glass, but in language, in memory, in the quiet, unshakable truth that once a soul has seen the light, no fire can unmake it. In Part 7, we will step forward into that truth, into the England that rose from the ashes, into the uneasy alliances, the unfinished reforms, and the quiet triumphs that still bore the heat of Thomas Hitton's flame. When the fire in Maidstone finally faded into memory, and the ashes of Thomas Hitton were swept into the cracks of the square like yesterday's dust, England did not stop spinning. The bells still rang for mass. The monarch still signed proclamations with the sweep of a quill. And life, for most, continued as it always had. But something had changed. Something quiet and invisible, like the first crack in ice before the thaw. And though the surface seemed unbroken, beneath it the warmth had begun to spread. Slow and certain and patient. For England, after ashes, was no longer the same land that had watched a man burn for reading the gospel aloud. It had become a country haunted by his silence. At court, the winds of power shifted daily. But even as Henry VIII stood firm in his titles, defender of the faith, sovereign of the realm, there were whispers threading through his conscience. Not because he mourned the heretic who had died without naming names, but because he had begun to question Rome, not in the name of God, but in the name of control. For Henry's quarrel with the Pope had less to do with theology than with heirs. And yet it was in this personal crisis that the gates creaked open. Just enough for the reformers to slip through. Thomas had never lived to see it. But the irony of his death echoed in every step the king took towards schism. For only a few years after the burning, Henry would do what Thomas had already done, in spirit reject papal authority, assert supremacy over the church in England, and begin the slow dismantling of the very structure that had condemned so many like him. But the king's reformation was not built on compassion or conscience. It was built on marriage, on lineage, on law. And so even as the monasteries fell and the Latin Mass grew quieter, the fires did not stop, only changed direction. And those who thought the gospel would now be free found instead that the crown could be just as merciless as the mitre. Still, something took root, not in the palaces, but in the villages, not among bishops, but among blacksmiths, for the people had seen what Rome could do, and now they were learning what the king could do. And in the space between those powers, they began to imagine something else, not a church of smoke and thrones, but a faith stitched into daily bread, whispered over water, passed from mother to daughter, not with fear, but with love. And that imagining, fragile as it was, kept growing. The English Bible, once contraband, once sewn into the hems of jackets and smuggled in barrels of wool, was now printed under royal license. Though not all versions were permitted, and not all passages were left untouched. But still, it was there, open on wooden stands in parish churches, pages turning beneath calloused fingers. And somewhere, someone was reading aloud the same verses that Thomas had once spoken in a barn. And for a moment, perhaps, his voice echoed through theirs, carried not by fire, but by breath. In the south, some remembered him not by name, but by story, a priest who read from the book and was burned for it, a man who walked calmly to his death, a teacher who said, God spoke plainly, and those stories became the soil for something England had never quite had before, a faith that did not require Latin, or lineage, or loyalty to any crown, only an open heart, and the courage to hear. There were still arrests, still executions. The tower did not empty, the stake did not rot, but each death was less effective than the last. Each fire burned shorter, for the more they punished, the more the people asked why, and the more they asked, the more they saw the cracks, and through those cracks, the light poured in. In the north, rebellion rose and was crushed. In the west, loyalty to Rome lingered like fog. But in the small chapels where new ministers now preached in English, something took shape, something not yet whole, not yet safe, but alive. And the children who had once learned to fear the church now learned to question it, and then to shape it, and then, quietly, to own it. And Thomas, though long dead, remained. He remained in the margins of old books where someone had scrawled, "He died for this." He remained in the letters of reformers who wrote from exile, remembering the first among them who had not fled. He remained in the silence that fell each time the scriptures were read aloud, and someone realized for the first time that they understood. He remained in the dreams of those who still believed faith should not cost a life, and so, England after ashes was not a land healed or whole. But it was a land changed, a land that had been forced to reckon with its own brutality, and found, in the smoking ruin of a single man's body, the spark of something sacred. And in Part 8, we will turn not to England, but to the wider world that watched and learned where reformers carried Thomas's story across oceans and centuries, where the death of one priest in a town square became a banner for freedom, and where the gospel, long buried beneath fear, rose again. The flames that consumed Thomas Hitton's body on that grey morning in Maidstone may have silenced his voice, but they did not kill his words, for the gospel he carried pressed to his chest, hidden in his heart, spoken through trembling breath into the ears of those who had never heard it before, could not be bound by rope, nor suffocated by smoke, nor broken by the groaning timber of the stake. And as his ashes scattered into the stones and soil of England, his gospel, his truth, rose like a prayer carried by wind, passing from mouth to mouth, page to page, century to century, until even those who had never heard his name were living proof that what he had given could not be undone. It travelled first through memory, quiet and unassuming, taking root in the lives of those who had stood in the crowd that day, not all, perhaps not even many, but enough to carry the story forward, enough to whisper to a child as they tucked them into bed. There was a man once who died because he wanted us to understand, and those whispers grew into retellings, and those retellings grew into teachings, until the memory of a single life became part of the very rhythm of the land, a heartbeat buried beneath sermons and psalms, pulsing through the veins of a church that had tried to forget. And while England continued to wrestle with its soul swinging between crown and council, between Roman chains and royal decrees, the story of Thomas's martyrdom slipped beyond its shores, carried by merchants and exiles, by missionaries and outlaws, by the restless hearts of reformers who found in his death not just tragedy but proof that a gospel worth dying for could never again be kept secret, that a truth read aloud in the tongue of fishermen and weavers could outlive 1,000 edicts and 100 kings. And so, across Europe, his name began to appear not as headline or heresy, but as hallowed memory, footnoted in texts, smuggled from Geneva, carved into the margins of psalters passed in secret through war-torn cities, spoken aloud in prayers before ships set sail, to new lands across oceans still untouched by the gospel's flame. In Wittenberg, students debated the merits of vernacular scripture, citing Hitton's trial as proof that England, too, had joined the long-suffering chain of saints. In Zurich and Strasbourg, theologians who had once scoffed at the English crown now saw in Thomas's death the mark of a deeper, purer conviction, not of politics, but of conscience. And in Antwerp, where William Tyndale continued his sacred labour under the constant threat of betrayal, the news of Thomas's execution became both grief and fuel. Another nail in the coffin of silence. Another reason to print faster, smuggle deeper, teach harder. And each new edition of the English Bible he sent across the Channel was not merely ink and paper, it was resistance, resurrection, reply. The gospel that Thomas had given his life for began to move with its own momentum. No longer just a translation, but a movement. No longer just a risk, but a calling. And even in the places where fire still ruled, where stakes were built and charges were drawn, the very act of reading became an act of rebellion. A soft and holy war, fought not with blade or banner, but with open pages and honest hearts. In time, the fires themselves began to falter not because the authorities grew kinder, but because the executions no longer worked. For every flame lit in punishment, lit 10 more in memory. And every heretic silenced gave birth to a dozen who would not be quiet. And the gospel, no longer chained to altars or hidden behind choirs, I began to speak in the kitchens of the poor, in the whispers of widows, in the songs of field workers, until it became a chorus that could not be burned. Even generations later, when the names of kings had changed, when the wars had shifted, when new conflicts rose from old hatreds, the story of Thomas Hitton did not vanish. For though the world rarely builds statues for quiet men, it remembers them in the places that matter most, in the silence before prayer, in the courage to speak truth aloud, in the choice to read what is forbidden and to believe what is costly. And so his gospel lived, not as relic but as rhythm, not as doctrine but as defiance wrapped in gentleness. And perhaps that is the truest miracle of all, not that one man was willing to die for Scripture, but that so many others chose to live in its light. Because he did. In Part 9, we will rest beside the memory of this man, not with tragedy, but with gratitude, not in mourning, but in the stillness that comes after the fire has burned, when the sky is clear, and the story, at last, has been heard. And now, as the story comes to its close, not with a shout, but with a soft and steady breath, we sit together at the edge of history. The room quiet, the world outside hushed in the blue of nightfall. And we remember him, not for the way he died, but for the way he lived, for the way he walked with bare feet and steady hands, for the way he carried a book like it was a child, fragile and sacred and full of hope, for the way he whispered truth not to build an army, but to feed a soul. And in this quiet hour, we are not watching flames or trial chambers or angry kings. We are simply watching a man close his eyes and choose, again and again, not safety, but light. It is easy to forget, in the noise of now, that once upon a time, a single word could get you killed, not a threat, not a lie, not even an insult, but a word written in the language of your mother, a word that said, God is near, and grace is free, and you are seen. And Thomas believed that word was worth everything, even when the world told him it was worth nothing at all. And so he carried it, not with pride, but with love, The kind of love that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, doesn't seek glory, but simply endures. And maybe that's what makes his story linger long after the fire has cooled. He didn't fight to be remembered. He didn't beg to be saved. He didn't try to change the world by force. He just read. He just taught. He just stayed true. And in the end, it was enough. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the stake is gone. Imagine the crowd is silent, not with fear, but with reverence. Imagine Thomas, no longer bound, walking through a field at dawn, the grass damp beneath his feet, the Bible open in his hands, the sky above him wide and clean and endless, and from somewhere beyond the trees, a voice clear and familiar says, "Well done, my child. You were never alone." Let that image stay with you as the night folds in. Let it remind you that truth does not always roar. Sometimes it walks quietly into a fire, and sometimes that's how the world begins to change. So sleep now. The story is finished, but the flame is still warm. Good night.